back. I hope people in the room enjoy their thematic sessions and the networking, and of course some of those smiley faces at the photo booth there in that area. And for those watching us online, this is the Brussels Economic Forum, and we are live from Brussels with the afternoon program. Now, this morning we had a number of high-level speakers discussing how social cohesion needs to remain at the heart of Europe's competitive model and how Europe needs ambition and courage to remain resilient. But we still have plenty of topics coming on this afternoon. Now, our first session this afternoon is really a highlight of the Brussels Economic Forum. This is the Oxford-style debate on emotion. Now, over the years, we've tried to keep you awake after that lunch break with thought-provoking topics. You might remember some of them, including the recent Brussels Economic Forum Oxford-style debates on the need to replace GDP with the alternative well-being indicator, or on the 4-day working week. Now, just like for those recent debates, the motion proposed today does not reflect the position of the European Commission, but simply wants to listen to the proponents and detractors of a topic that is increasingly prominent in the public debate. Today we will all have the opportunity to vote and decide the winner. It's always in the room, and from home we'll be voting and how you may have a change of heart or not during the debate. Now, the motion for debate is: this forum believes that a cashless society would be beneficial for people and for the economy. Everyone should be free to choose how to pay for their everyday purchases, be it in cash or in electronic format. Cash is, of course, about privacy. It is also about social inclusion, as vulnerable groups often feel excluded by digital banking. It helps to budget. It can be used in difficult situations, even when there is a power outage, to pay for essential goods and services. But while cash is still the most popular means of payment among Europeans, its use has been declining as people increasingly pay with their cards, apps and mobile phones. New means of payment open new possibilities and can help fight money laundering as well. So, is a cashless society better for people and for the economy? Before our debate begins, we're going to start with a poll to find out where you, the audience, stand on this motion. Do you agree or do you disagree with the motion that this forum believes that a cashless society would be beneficial for people and for the economy? Please vote now by Slido using the same code as you know it already. It is EUBEF23. You can see it here on the screens on stage as well. Now, the vote is now open, so please grab your phones, go to Slido or to the Brussels Economic Forum 2023 web page as well, and tell us, what do you think? We're actually going to ask you to vote twice on this right now before the debate to get your gut reactions, and again after you've heard the speakers' arguments to see if the debate affected you and if you changed your mind somehow. Now, while you're all voting, I will introduce our speakers. Speaking in favor of the motion, we have Cecilia Skinsley, head of the Innovation Hub at the Bank of International Settlements, and speaking against the motion, we have Brad Scott, financial journalist and author. Please join me. Hi. Hello. Hi. Right, let's have a look at the first result of the initial vote. You could have it here on the screen, so we're going to see it. I hope you used it. Yes. Right, that's interesting. 59, 58 to 42. I'm against, I'm in favor. That's an interesting situation. Now, this is the vote now before we hear the arguments of the speakers. This is how it's going to go. Every speaker will have 8 minutes first to present their motion, and then they will also have 5 minutes each to rebuttal. Now, Cecilia will start with her arguments in favor of the motion. The floor is now yours, and you have 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to start by congratulating the organizers of coming up with such a creative exercise. Unfortunately, the world is not as black and white as the headline imply, so I'm going to start by throwing a little bit of cold water over the whole exercise, but rest assured, I'm sure Brett and I will have different views about this, and there will be debate and disagreements. But to be clear, I have nothing against cash. As a matter of fact, in my previous job as a deputy governor of the Swedish Central Bank for time speaking at events and meetings about the importance of protecting people's right to access to and paying with cash. Happy to say that Swedish politicians took some notes of this, and there is now legislation in place regulating geographically specific access rules for getting access to cash. And lately there has also been an initiative, still not a law, to protect the right to pay at least essential goods with cash. I think about cash, it works as a payment method of last resort. It will work if there's a data. It's no longer sufficient to meet societal needs, and it's not fit for purpose given the technical changes we observe around us. We could speak at length about how big tech and our smartphones changes how we live, but it's a fact that we change how we live and interact with one another. And even if we have protection for cash usage, I think we need to plan for a future where cash will play little to no role in our lives. So my testimony is about how we need to set about preparing ourselves for a possible cashless society and make sure that it works for people. At the end of this session, if you all think that Brett is right and you decide that you should like to use some more cash, I can tell you something, that you will all be fine, because you can just nip down the street to the nearest ATM and get some. And then if you change your mind, you just deposit it back, because we're all living in a part of the world where there are options. But most fit for purpose, and for major parts of the world outside Europe, people need many more choices than only have access to cash. You think about cash as it is being a very inclusive way of holding money and making payments, but it does not promote access to financial services beyond the many basic needs. So why do I then think a cashless society could be beneficial for people in the economy? Well, the same drivers that are changing our behaviors and going away from cash is also the drivers that are coming up with new offers, new solutions new solutions to problems that cash and the traditional financial services have never been able to solve. Now let me get into this a little bit. People who I would call cash-only people are outside the services that are being offered by the financial system. They don't have access to credit, to saving products or insurance, and they can only use the most basic payment services. If they want credit, saving products or insurance, they usually have to rely on much more unreliable providers than what the regulated financial system can offer. And they usually have to pay much more to get. Think gold traders and think mafia, and you know what kind of life these people are living in. Let's also talk about the anonymity of cash, which I think we will hear in a few minutes is being held as the great advantage for people. But anonymity is a two-edged sword. It has a major shortcoming. It means that others don't know who you are, and they can't figure out, are you a good payer? Are you capable of handling a saving? Can you carry a loan and such things? Credit is a bit of a conundrum. If you have it, you could ask for more if you want to smooth out your consumption or need to make investments over the course of your life. But if you've never had a credit, it's very hard to get it. And here again, technology that is driving our behavior out of cash actually offers solutions. Sometimes it's easy to get the financial industry and big techs really wanting to take away our freedoms, and the cash, protecting cash is the remedy to this. And if, let's assume that's correct, let's just say that there is a conspiracy out there. Well, I would say here we need to make sure and double down on the structures of the financial system. And this is a capital which is leading in the world and would say a role model for others to have a look at this. And we're already doing that for the many EU institutions. Regulate, supervise, and make sure that the public policy objectives are being put in the front seat and not commercial interests. A vision of a cashless society is also waking worries about the big brother society. So let's talk about that. I think that looking out for people's integrity is a core role for the legislators. And the policy area here about the big brother or big tech brother looking into our lives is much bigger than it's only about money and cash. We all live with our smartphones and CCTV cameras around us, and I think there's a lot of things going on that many of us don't really know what's going on. So again, this is a much bigger question than money only, and I think here the legislators need to double down on their ambitions, regulate data harvesting so that data becomes in the hands of the individuals rather than corporations and states. Making sure cashless society work is also about building infrastructures, allowing for competition, innovation and inclusiveness. I don't think protecting cash and try to stay away from banks and big techs with suspicion is good enough. Last but not least, let me give you a little concrete example of what tech and finance actually can bring to help people and give them more choices. I was in India recently and checked out the work they're doing there in terms of building more financial services with a digital ID system, Aadhaar, together with fast payment systems. I met Indian farmers. And one particular farmer was very happy because he had a record harvest and cabbage prices, he was into cabbages, had just skyrocketed. And he could sell his harvest for quite a lot of money and he could take a bag of cash because usually it's not safe to keep that on their home to the bank. And he wanted to say, I want to open a bank account. It's quite a job to get into the banking system, but once you're there, it's very helpful. If you're not there, you have quite a job because banks are mandated by law to make sure that the money comes from selling cabbage and not something illegal. And if you don't have the things in order, like an ID, think about our farmer with a lot of cash in hand, perhaps take out a loan, buy insurances, diversify his crops, or have insurance against price swings. And so if the next year and he would have a problem, he would be very poor again. So I think we're moving towards a cashless society. I don't think it's a problem, and I think through legislation, regulation, supervision and the right infrastructures can actually make things work much better for people. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was a bit over 8 minutes, so that's fair. You can have a little bit over 8 minutes for you, please. There we go.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Cecilia. That was very interesting. And thanks for having me here. And I've been excited about this debate, actually, because I go around the world a lot to talk about the cash issue, and I'm always interested to see how different communities are talking about it. And actually, today, when I was listening to the panels, I was actually hearing a lot of common themes I hear in many, many places across the world. Almost no matter where I go, no matter what the country is, actually, you'll often hear a very common story about digital transformation or the digital transition. And today, it was mentioned a lot. And it's quite interesting when you hear this narrative. It's like a meta-narrative in our society. A lot of political leaders and business leaders will channel this idea that digital automation and the scale, speed, and interconnection that it brings is not only good, but somehow unstoppable. It's a little bit like some kind of weather system moving in, and everybody's kind of waiting for it. Right? This is how it's presented. And in this context, you have three choices. You're either told to lead the way, go with it, be the pioneer. Alternatively, if you don't want to lead the way, you're told that actually you're going to have to adapt and keep up. All right? And this creates a secondary narrative, actually creates three sub-narratives. The first one is the left-behind narrative. If you don't do this, you'll be left behind. All right? That then creates an inclusion narrative. All the people who are left behind will have to find ways to include them into the system. And then it creates a delay narrative, which is to say, let's slow the transition down slightly to give them time to catch up. All right? Now, you'll find this narrative across the world, but when it comes to the monetary system, we find it applied to cash. All right? The monetary system is actually a composite system with multiple different types of issuers of money issuing different types of money in different forms. But when it comes to this narrative we have in the public, it's reduced to a simple binary between physical versus digital, and then the digital is imagined to automatically just take over from the physical, and it's perceived as being a kind of an upgrade. Much like the email is an upgrade to the fax machine, or the car is an upgrade to the horse cart. So actually cash ends up being cast as kind of like the horse cart of payments, and there's some sad people who still have to use the horse cart. We must give them some more time because they still use it, right? This is a very common narrative we find in the public. Some people still use cash. Give them time to get on board. And not only is it presented as some kind of inevitability, but it's actually presented as cash has negative impacts on society. The three major categories of insults thrown against it are that it's old and outdated, that it's somehow inefficient, inconvenient, and that it's dangerous. It creates social ills. And these are the things that anti-cash proponents throw at us. I'm going to offer you two metaphors to help break this narrative and help recalibrate how you think about cash in society. The first metaphor shows us that actually our digital systems, public confidence in our digital systems is predicated upon people's belief in the in the cash system. All right. Now, to understand this, you've got to think about casinos. All right. If I go to a casino and I hand over cash to a casino, they issue me chips in return. Those chips are a secondary form of money that can be used in the casino. Actually, the banking sector is very similar. When I go to a bank and hand over cash, they issue me digital chips that I see in my account. Those digital chips are actually promises for that first type of money. And actually, our confidence in that digital money is predicated upon access to cash. So ironically, if you undermine the cash system, you simultaneously undermine public confidence in the digital systems. So even if you don't like cash, even if you perceive it to be inefficient, you've got to realize that it actually underpins the digital systems itself. All right? And that has legal implications. Imagine if a casino, for example, was to prevent you going back with your chips to redeem them for cash. That's basically what banks do when they shut down ATMs. They're saying, we're going to stop you exiting our systems. You will have to use our digital chips. And this is why the cashless society is actually a euphemism for a type of enclosure by the banking sector and the big tech sector. Now I'm going to offer one other metaphor to help sort of maybe get to a slightly different element of the issue, because most people in the public don't understand the legal and sort of financial stability aspects of the kind of cash. Central bankers understand that, but maybe people in the public don't. So when you go to a person in the public, I'll often use a different metaphor. As I mentioned, cash is often cast as being the horse cart of payments, some kind of old, outdated form. Everything changes, though, when you suddenly recast cash as being the bicycle of payments, or even the mountain bike of payments. Most people understand that in all our systems, we actually like to keep balances of power between different types of things. If I'm in a skyscraper, I might like using the lifts to go up, but it doesn't mean I want the stairs to be taken out of the skyscraper. Most of our systems keep balances of power between different modes in order to protect the resilience of those systems. So imagine in our transport metaphor, think about digital payments as being like the Uber of payments, all right? And cash as being the bicycle of payments. Now, I'm assuming most of you know what Uber is, and maybe you find it convenient. Maybe you like it on a late night on a Friday and you're a bit drunk and you want to go home and you order an Uber. It's very convenient in that context. But the mere fact that you order an Uber doesn't mean you've asked the city to remove bicycle lanes. Actually, most people want a choice between different modes of transport in a city. Uber actually did take over the entire transport system. What would happen in that context. Not only would you transfer a massive amount of power to a single company, or maybe an oligopoly of companies, but you'd have huge resilience problems in your system. If Uber goes down, the entire transport system freezes. It would have massive data implications, all right? So privacy is an aspect of this, but it's not the only aspect. It would have huge amounts of data harvesting, huge ability to prevent you moving if Uber decided you didn't get to move. But also massive exclusion problems, people who can't use it, who don't want to use it. And then actual centralization problems in your economy. Imagine if the only way you can move is going via a huge central entity all the time. All right? And this is how you should be thinking about the cashless society. When we're talking about cash, I'm not saying everybody should always be using cash, but you've got to keep that cash system to maintain a balance of power between the different players in the monetary system. In the cashless society, you have huge exclusion problems, which have already been mentioned. You have massive data surveillance problems, but you also have potential problems of, say, authoritarian states using the people's dependence upon the digital money system to control behavior. That's a big concern. You also have, resilience problems, this idea that the whole system goes down when the electricity goes down, or when there's a cyber attack, or when there's some kind of bug in the system. But more importantly, and often overlooked, is actually this total digitization is often an attack on local economies. Right? Imagine if, for example, one of your children is trying to sell something to one of their friends in the playground as a sort of fun activity, and Visa and MasterCard, thousands of kilometers away, are taking fees from that interaction, that small-scale interaction between two human beings. Actually, most of our economies have a balance between formal and informal, and actually many parts of the informal economy are very positive. If I'm playing poker game with my friends at home, I don't need a giant institution somewhere intermediating between me and my friend. All right, so human beings actually like some degree of peer-to-peer interaction, and cash protects that. So I'm going to end it there. And I think it's important to not only protect cash, but to actively promote it as being better than digital in many situations. Much like the bicycle is often better than Uber in certain situations. And we can maintain both of these.
Thank you so much. That was round one, and now we're going to round two, and speakers have now 5 minutes each to rebuttal. Celia, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. So I'm going to focus around 3 things that Brett mentioned, and I'm going to try to see if I can reinforce my message that I think a cashless society is actually coming. And if we take the right steps, we're going to make it work for people. So is technology inevitable? I think that is a very important question to ask. And I would say, yeah, it may sound like that, but I would say ultimately the question is no. The answer is no to that question, because after all, it's us humans who are running the world. It may seem like it's technology, but it's all run by people. And I think we have for some time been living in a political sentiment where our starting point or ending point of the conversation is that the private sector always knows best. And private sector, they have a revenue maximizing objective, which is great because that is creating a lot of welfare in society. We can tax it, it can provide jobs, innovation, etc. But when we are in times in history where there is a tipping point into a new equilibrium, new society, when we see sort of general purpose technology spreading out, I think we need to have a stronger leadership from the legislators. We've seen it when electricity came, we saw it with combustion engineering, the whole industrialization, a lot of Klondike and misbehaving and failures and people suffering as a result. But eventually we learn from these things and we put the right legislations and the right supervision in place. Technology is moving forward no matter what we think about that. We can be misused, we all know that. It's about making sure that we harness it and we use it for people's service and not the other one around. Then Brett goes into comparing the banking sector with the casino. This is the banking system we have in the world that has turned out to be the most successful model after all other models through history has actually been rejected. It has fragility, so we can see that. Some banks are going under as a result, but it has created an enormous wealth in the world in terms of people getting access to savings products, safe and diversified savings products. They have access to credits, and they have access to different kinds of insurance. And what is being called a casino here is a pretty advanced system that is actually very welfare enhancing for our lives. But, and this is an important but, we have to make sure that it stays servicing people's needs and not the other way around. And we could speak at length about capital regulations and supervision and the likes, but so far it's the best. And last but not least, I agree with the comments that Brett make about the sentiment around cash. Is welfare enhancing to be able to have choices, and more choices is more welfare enhancing. So that's why, as I said in my introduction, I think it was important in the case of Sweden that the accessibility and usability of cash remains, and it's there as the payment provider of last resort if things goes bad in terms of electricity and the likes. But all of this doesn't stop people changing their behavior. And the example of two children wanting to make a transaction in a play park, if you would go out to an average teenager or 10-year-old, they will probably not recognize the notes anymore. That is the reality we're in, and it's just going to get more of that. So let's make sure it works for people so they trust it, even if it's on a touchpad or in a smartphone or in a clock. And about finding the right balance between the private sector and the public sector, I think, again, that we are at a tipping point into a new world, and the legislation has to be much more up there and make sure that public policy objectives are being protected and not always been listening to what big tech and Big Fin is telling them. The interest of people's needs should be left, right and center of such a program. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Brett, your turn. 5 minutes.
Sure. Just to clarify, when I use the casino metaphor, I'm not trying to make out that the banking sector behaves like a casino, albeit sometimes it does, as we all know. It was more a sort of a metaphor to showcase, when you're holding a casino chip in your hand, the reason why you believe in this thing and the reason why you can pass it around is precisely that you believe it has redeemability back into state money. Similar with the banking sector. Regardless of whether the banking sector behaves well or badly, those units in our bank account essentially are tethered back into the public money system. If you undermine the public money system, you have serious problems for those units, which incidentally is part of the reason why there's all the discussion about the digital euro right now, precisely because of the potential financial stability issues that are emerging. So that was just to clarify on that. But having said that, even if the banking sector does create good things, and of course it does, everything, all there's many sort of, multifaceted elements to these systems, that doesn't mean we give it 100% power, all right? The whole point about balance of power narratives is that you say, we don't want one party to have all the power, because when they have all the power, that's when all the bad things start to happen, right? Balance of power ideas are saying, we want to try and prevent the worst excesses of a system coming out by providing an alternative. All right? And that's why I say, for example, using the Uber versus bicycle narrative, it doesn't mean we don't always want to use a bicycle, but if we had no choice but to use Uber, you'd suddenly realize what a bad situation that was, because you'd have no balance of power. It's precisely the fact that you have access to something else that makes Uber empowering in the first place. And to go back to the points around financial inclusion and digital inclusion, I often hear the story that somehow if you're living in a cash economy, digital finance. That's not true. That's like saying having a bicycle is preventing you getting access to a car. That's not true, right? There's a separate issue of how you promote digital inclusion, right? And promoting digital inclusion does not mean you're getting rid of the other system. It means you're providing a balanced system with multiple options. That's what digital inclusion is about. You entirely can have a cash economy alongside a digital economy. Right? You can have a balance of power between these things. You can have an economy where people use both of those and have access to digital financial services and can build data on themselves that can be used for credit scoring, which is what you were also mentioning. Right? None of this says you have to get rid of the cash system. And in fact, if you get rid of the cash system, all the worst excesses of that other system come out. All right? One thing I also want to note here is that a lot of people, especially, I'm slightly frustrated. There's almost a kind of belief that this is sort of happening in an organic, bottom-up kind of way. It's going to have quite a sort of passive way of approaching it, right? Without thinking about the fact that the public's perception of this issue has been deeply affected by a highly active industry. I guarantee you the banking sector, big tech, fintechs don't go about saying, well, it looks like the public's turning to our systems. And maybe we should serve them because they're turning to us. No, they actively promote their systems. They actively go out to get you to use their systems. They're active players, all right? If you have a passive central bank, for example, that doesn't do anything in response to that, well, of course, the private sector players are going to take over because they're actively promoting their systems to society. You have to have an active counter-push back to create that balance. And this is an interesting metaphor to use in this regard. We go back to the transport metaphor. To get things like bicycle lanes, pedestrianized streets, took active political organizing from people to say, you know what, the car industry has dominated for an incredibly long time, we want to push back. And creates a cultural alternative that says it's totally okay to not be dependent upon the car industry. Right now, with the cash debate, we don't have that. Right now, people are stuck in this idea that it's like, oh, well, it's in the past, it's never going to come back. That's not true. There's a lot of resistance from people in the streets who are actually saying, we don't have many people who actually like human-scale local transactions. And there's definitely going to be a pushback coming. And I have 40 seconds left. I think we shouldn't be complacent about this digital transition narrative. Right now, everybody thinks that it's inevitable, but it's not obvious that it's going to last, the digital transition narrative. Levels of burnout are going up incredibly. People are getting disorientated by digital systems. They're getting confused. There's no guarantee that sort of digital hype carries on indefinitely. Actually, people can start to turn against digital systems and actually push back towards analog systems. So I think we should bear that in mind, especially in the future with climate change, where these digital systems actually become very vulnerable.
Dan, thank you so much. Don't you just love this format? It's just such a great part of the Brussels Economic Forum. Thank you so much to both speakers. Now, we're going to go back to Slido. And this is the trick. Now we're going to see how it worked. 2 rounds, 8 minutes, and then 5 minutes to rebuttal. Let's see what you think now. So you know what to do, Slido. You go for the code EUBEF23 and then you vote. And we're going to be able to see the results. And I'm really looking forward to see how did it work. Whether you changed your mind or maybe you didn't and you're voting once again. Well, that's it. We should have asked you to vote as well somehow. You know, that would be interesting to see how the debate went. That would be great. That's it. So we had 52 and 48 in the beginning. We have 72, 28. That's a big change there.
Congratulations.
That's a big... Good job. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both speakers. Thank you. And thank you everybody for voting. Congratulations. Thank you. Our next speaker is an award-winning young economist. He was awarded the 2022 European Central Bank Young Economist Prize, which was based on the topic of challenges for monetary policy in a rapidly changing world. Now, I will be chatting to him about his paper on finance over the life cycle of firms and how this is extremely relevant to today's discussions about Europe's competitiveness. Now, I'm pleased to invite on stage Federico Cochin, postdoctoral research scholar within the economics division at Columbia Business School. And Federico is now moving, not now, this summer, moving to SEMFI in Madrid as a tenure track professor of economics. That's next. Federico, please join me on stage here. Hi. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. That's a great welcome you're getting there. Let's dive in. Your winning paper on finance over the life cycle of firms documents significant differences in firms' access to finance over their life cycles across countries. What are the main differences between younger and older firms, and other differences between the countries, specifically when it comes to Europe?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here and participate in this very important forum. So in my paper, I use firm-level microdata from a set of 21 European countries, which I divide into two, a set of high and a set of middle-income countries, to document a set of facts about finance, survival, and growth, which can be summarized as follows. First, I document that younger firms, compared to older firms, use more debt, or they borrow more, they pay higher interest rates, and receive more equity injections from shareholders than older firms. So these three facts suggest that younger firms rely more on external financing than older firms do. I also document that younger firms exit more and have higher and more dispersed growth rates than older firms. So these facts suggest that younger firms also have more uncertainty and face higher risk than older firms. With respect to the differences across countries within Europe, I find that firms in middle-income countries borrow less while paying higher interest rates. Additionally, they exit more and have higher and more volatile growth rates. And something that is interesting and very notable is that the differences across countries are especially pronounced among younger firms. Put differently, if we look at the older firms across these economies, older firms are more similar in terms of their financing and their growth, but this is not the case for the younger firms. Hence, being a young firm or a startup in middle-income countries implies a more dire or more challenging prospects. Now, of course, the question is, why should we care about these facts? And in the next part of the paper, I'm going to develop a quantitative model, a quantitative macro model, which is going to help me to, number one, interpret this empirical evidence, and second, to quantify how important is finance for the macroeconomy. This model is going to be characterized by two key building blocks. The first building block is that firms are going to face a detailed capital structure decision, and there's going to be a notion about learning about firm profitability over time. Using this model, I find that finance or lack of financing lead to big output losses in these economies, and the losses that I quantify in the middle-income countries are 60% higher than the ones I quantify for the high-income countries. And kind of understanding the channels or the mechanisms that drive these output losses is important, especially to guide policy. The main finding of my paper is that finance matters not because of the usual channels previously studied in the literature, such as capital misallocation. Rather, I find that finance matters because of a new channel through which financial frictions distort firms' exit decisions. And this is going to be especially the case for young firms. So let me give you the economic intuition behind this key finding of the paper. In the economy, there's going to be a large number of young and uncertain firms that exit prematurely relative to a perfect credit benchmark, because for those firms, the cost of external financing is higher than the option value of learning. Hence, the economy would be better off if these young firms would have continued operating longer and realize whether they were profitable or not. Or in other words, we're losing some of these young firms that might have been better or that have been profitable later in their lives. And as I described, these losses coming from the exit margin because of financial frictions are more important or are particularly severe in these economies, these middle-income economies that have less developed financial markets and where firms face more volatile shocks.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting, especially as firms' reliance on external financing will likely increase as a part of the digital change and the development of innovative technologies for the green transition. Now, what can we learn, our takeaway from your analysis concerning these innovative sectors, which are central to the whole Europe's competitiveness?
Characteristics of firms in those sectors, which kind of relate to my work. The first one is that firms in these innovative sectors, let's think tech or the green technologies, are likely to face more uncertainty and risk than other firms in more established sectors. And the second interesting characteristic is that this type of firms have a particular cash profile, so that, for example, implies that they require very large initial investments early on in their life, while the profits or the cash flows are going to be later in their lifetimes. These two characteristics are going to make that these type of firms are going to have a hard time to get access to financing through the standard sources, such as debt financing with financial institutions. And hence, the type of distortions that I was describing in terms of the exit margin for young firms may be particularly severe in this type of sectors. Hence, the evidence in my paper, or the findings in my paper, suggest that to improve Europe's role in these type of sectors, there should be a better development of other sources of financing for this type of firms. What are these other sources of financing? I think of particularly equity markets are particularly important in this respect.
Federico, and just before you go, what are your recommendations to the Brussels Economic Forum? What is the first and the most important thing that we should be doing to ensure that this competitiveness of the European economy in the current context?
Right. Well, that's a hard question. So let me just stay within the boundaries of my research, because there's other very important subjects. Most of them have been covered today, or have been covered later, or will be covered later. So within the findings of my paper, I think that the most important takeaway is that finance matters, especially for this exit decision of young firms that I was describing. And I think that there's two main policy implications from this particular paper. The first policy implication is that firm size and firm age does not always coincide. However, most of the policies that we currently have to foster entrepreneurial sectors follow a size criteria and target mostly small and medium-sized firms. Through the findings of my paper, this suggests that targeting better this type of policies and target through firm age, not firm size, could be more beneficial in terms of the cost-benefit of this type of policies. The second main policy implication of my work is related to the fact that I was describing earlier about the development of equity markets. And I'm not thinking only on equity markets for public firms, I'm also thinking of equity markets for private firms. That is going to be particularly important for these innovative sectors that we were discussing earlier.
Thank you so much. Federico Cushion, 2022 European Central Bank Young Economist Prize winner, and you can catch him from this summer in Madrid at Sanfi as a tenure-track professor of economics. Thank you so much. Stay with me. The next session is going to look at the role of skills in ensuring that Europe's economy remains relevant, sustainable and competitive. As you probably know, the year 2023 has been declared the European Year of Skills, precisely to highlight how having a workforce with the skills that are in demand is crucial for the people and in general for the economy. Now, our next speaker is an innovative leader in the field of digital transformation. She specializes in digital upskilling and leadership that prepares people for the next challenges of the digital world. Now, please join Federico and myself as we join here on stage Claudia Olsen, who will be talking to us about shaping the AI-ready workforce, preparing Europe for the generative AI era. Federico, thank you. Claudia.
It's a great honor to meet all of you today and be part of this fantastic forum and to talk about one of the most transformative changes that we might experience during our lifetime. I'm going to present a little bit about what we need to know about generative AI and what is happening. And I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Stellar Capacity. We're based in Sweden. We work with companies from all across Europe. And our mission is to help companies to become more digitally skilled and to develop a digital leadership. We train and teach skills that robots can't replace. Generative AI is so extraordinary because in many ways it can mimic human creativity, creating texts, art, videos, in almost the same way as we humans would approach many of these tasks. Many of us have heard about the companies behind some of the large language models, like Anthropic, OpenAI. We've heard about Google's AI. We've heard about Midjourney. And in the coming years, there will be many more companies that will arise in this space as well. What makes it so extraordinary is that generative AI can actually help us with quite strategic, advanced tasks in the years to come. We're seeing, for example, that already now we have Meta's Cicero, that just a few months ago was able to basically negotiate to win the game of diplomacy. And you can imagine how handy this might come in Brussels and in our international negotiations when we have an AI that is supporting us and trying to find the best possible outcomes going forward. Generative AI can also help us create synthetic data in those cases where we want to make sure that we don't have to struggle with privacy issues, when we want to protect individual data. And it can also help us create large data sets, for example, for rare diseases, when it's too expensive to generate original data. We can also simulate the different developments in terms of climate change. We can simulate developments in terms of migration, in terms of global developments, and be supported by AI to really make sure that we can make the best possible decisions. What is so revolutionary is that generative AI is actually able to understand human language. And that is, in one way, breaking down the communication barriers between technology and human. And this also means that right now in Europe, we're unleashing so much entrepreneurial power with the help of generative AI. An entrepreneur from Poland, Ukraine, Sweden can, for example, in less than 30 minutes, come up with an idea, test the idea by having generative AI find competitors, suppliers, by designing market copy, emails, launch a website. So each and every person, basically in Europe, that has an idea, has access to the computer, and that learns the necessary skill, can actually develop new solutions and new ventures. This fundamental impact on our economy will be huge, and some people actually believe that it might be as large and as impactful as the launch of the internet. Goldman Sachs actually estimated that it can lead to a 7% increase of our GDP over the coming 10 years. That's how profound it actually can become. Now, of course, this will have an impact on our jobs and our job market. Currently, in Europe, we have about 194 million employed people in the overall economy, out of which 78 million people are working in the knowledge economy. And here there are a lot of research indicating that up to 1/4 of the jobs in the knowledge economy might be replaced, complemented, in different ways taken over by generative AI. And the question is, of course, then, what will happen with those roughly 20 million jobs that are then being impacted? Are we able to actually meet this change and generate enough new job opportunities fast enough to cope with this change? Well, one thing is that history has definitely showed us that large technological shifts and changes lead to new job creation, and often to jobs that are very hard to preview before they actually arise and before we start working in them. For example, now we see one job description and one job that is really on the rise, and that is prompt engineers. Basically, engineers that are really good at instructing generative AI in terms of what outcome we're looking for. And we can also see that there are new jobs arising in connection to the metaverse economy. But also, as generative AI is developing, we can expect, for example, emotionality programmers. We can expect law experts connected to the generative AI economy and development. So there will be a lot of new jobs arising. One important fact, though, to think about is that we need to think about the pipeline as well in terms of job creation. And it's very easy to think, wonderful, now I have generative AI that writes all the basic texts, all the copy, and generates the photos. That means that I don't have to employ the junior associates. I only need the experts nowadays. But if we think about the economy and we think about how experts are created, many experts, of course, need to learn from scratch. We build experience with time. And if we want to build a solid pipeline for the economy, we are going to need to train people over time as well and make sure that we also hire younger associates, new associates that can learn using generative AI from start, of course, to become the experts we need in the future. Now, of course, we need to think about the risks that come with generative AI, and this is going to be a huge topic in the years to come. Because some of the risks that we need to understand and work with is, for example, the bias that generative AI is bringing from our existing data. It is about security and the fact that we have so many different actors that might actually use generative AI to create even more damaging viruses, for example, and use it for cyber warfare. We also see that we need to think about the privacy, and a lot of people that do not know exactly what they can share or not in the systems need to be educated. And of course, we need to think about the creative rights of artists, of writers, of authors in this new economy. What is important, though, is that we need to understand that it's hard to preview all possible different dangers right now. We need to think about possible risks But many of the risks we'll also learn about while we continue developing the technology and using them and understanding how they work in practice. And to do this, skills development. But I believe we need to think about skills development a little bit differently. During the past years, I've often heard the quote that 4 of 10 adults in Europe are lacking basic digital skills. And I would want to challenge that a little bit, because I believe that the basic digital skills we looked at 3 years ago or 5 years ago are no longer the digital basic skills that we need to learn today. Right now, with generative AI that is able to interpret what we say and those interactions requires a new skill set that will be needed in the AI economy. One thing that, for example, World Economic Forum highlights is that something that's going to be greatly important is to ask great, productive questions, but also skillfully interrogate questionable answers from the AI tools. That means that we need to be good at asking the right questions, but also be able to judge whether the answers we're getting are good, qualitative enough, if we can trust them or not. That's a skill we need to train across Europe. In addition, with stellar capacity, when we train digital leadership and skills across Europe, we're now seeing that governments, that companies are recognizing that digital skills are really not just about technical skills. They're also about putting the human in center and making sure that we excel in our human skills to drive the digital economy forward. We need to become better at curiosity, at continuous learning, at critical thinking, at emotional intelligence. Basically bringing together what we used to define as soft skills and hard skills into power skills that are driving the digital economy forward. Because these will be needed if we want to solve the big challenges in terms of a green transition, in terms of safe, secure society going forward. So to summarize, generative AI will have a profound impact on our economy going forward. And we're unlocking huge entrepreneurial forces. We are basically enabling almost every European to become an entrepreneur. And jobs will be replaced, they will be complemented, but they will also be created. And that is something we need to strive towards and work very actively to enable. And I believe that the skills development really makes sure that our economy continues to develop and goes forward. And we need to put humans at the center of this technology. Technological development and of our technological decisions.
Thank you so much. Claudia Olsen, thank you so much for this talk. Thank you. And for the next...
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paula Tam. I'm a reporter with Politico covering economic affairs, and I'm joined by a most distinguished panel. Please welcome Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, in charge of the economy, Jim Hagemann-Schnabe, who is chairman of Siemens and Northvolt, and Ben Lange, member of the European Parliament and chair of the International Trade Committee. And online joining us, we have Beata Jaworczyk, who is chief economist at the EBRD, and Professor Linda Yu, who is professor of economics at London Business School. Give them a round of applause. So we're here today because we're entering an era of geoeconomic fragmentation, where geopolitical considerations are increasingly trumping economic efficiency. The IMF earlier this year delivered a stark warning that this reorganization of trade along geopolitical lines could cost up to 7% of the world output. ECB President Christine Lagarde said that it might have an inflationary impact, pushing prices higher by 5% in the short term. So whether we call it restored, supply chains were disrupted by COVID, then by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, increasingly by geopolitical tensions by the world's top two superpowers, China and the US. Inflation is high, and it doesn't look that it will go away very soon. So economic blocs are competing in a global race for clean technology. Today is, what are Europe's options to ensure that its industries stay competitive? So for the audience following us online, if you want to interact with us, please go on Slido and look for the tag EUBEF23. And also feel free to use the hashtag EUBEF23. Good, let's jump right on it. We've talked about industry and the challenges coming from high energy costs and the subsidy raised from third countries. The EU's response was the European Green Deal Industrial Plan, focusing on industrial production targets, tax breaks, and more state aid for companies based in Europe. However, critics say that doing that risks undermining the single market, and it's not worth entering a race that we cannot win, given the lack of common European funding. The European Commission and yourself in the lead are going to present the European Economic Security Strategy next month. So what are we going to see in it? First for the Vice President, and then to Chairman Schnabe, what would you like to see in there?
Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, thank you for these invitations to Brussels Economic Forum. It's always a pleasure to be here. As regards EU's response to this globally more conflictual geopolitical context, you already outlined supply chain disruptions we had been facing in recent years, and some elements of the EU response, including our Green Deal industrial plan. And indeed, in this context, we are also looking more at the issues related to our economic security. I will come back to economic security strategy in a moment, but just to mention one important element for our, more I would say economic resilience, which is access to raw materials. That's why we recently came also with a critical raw materials strategy, because when we are now moving away from our dependency from fossil fuels, and we know how difficult it was to get away from this dependency from Russian fossil fuels, especially natural gas, it's important that we are not creating another strategic dependency on inputs which are needed for green and digital economy. So it's on one hand important to have this raw materials strategy, how we can develop mutually beneficial partnerships with resource-rich countries, allowing them to develop their own value chains, but for EU also getting access to necessary inputs. And then moving to the question of economic security. I think first we need to define what we mean with economic security, and primarily we are discussing here relatively narrow issues which are related to national security questions. So it's not over encompassing, not trying to cover the whole economic resilience related issues. So this is one important element. Another important element, I think it's important that it's risk-based, that we are clearly assessing what are the risks we are facing, what are the instruments, how to best address them. So this is with this approach we are now starting to work on this strategy. It must be said it's now high also in international agenda. We have this as a work stream in G7, and G7 Japanese presidency is very keen to advance it on specific instruments. We'll be looking, for example, whether it's necessary and in which form to set up some outbound investment screening mechanism, because we already have our inward FDI screening mechanism, even though also there one can look for certain improvements. But at the end of the day, it's important that we remain focused, and that this whole economic security does not become a pretext for mercantilism and protectionism.
Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. It's not often I get a question like that, so I will enjoy that moment, and great to be here. My assumption is that we are at an inflection point in history where we not only need to, but we also have economic benefits of dramatically accelerating sustainable solutions. So the decarbonized versions of most value chains in the world can be now delivered at scale because the technology is available and it's becoming a good business. That's my starting assumption. And I see that, Siemens is having the biggest growth rate since 20 years in very difficult, market conditions. It's an indicator that there are business opportunities out there. Now, if I'm right in this assumption that we are at that inflection point, you can then put regulation in that either limits things or accelerate things. And I'm probably on the acceleration side. I understand the need to make sure we don't create new dependencies, but I actually believe that if I had any wish that I could have, it would be around acceleration. How do we dramatically accelerate the scale of installing sustainable solutions in most of the, let's say, critical infrastructures that we need, and through that, showcase the world in Europe how it can be done, how you can make money and business on that, and export that knowledge and solutions to the rest of the world. So my wish list is anything that accelerates those kinds of solutions.
Thank you for that. Hey Lange, anything to add on this first topic?
Yeah, I think it's a quite easy answer. We are really living in a fragmented globalization, but it's still globalization, and trade is increasing. Not so much than previous years, but more or less in line with the increase of the GDP. So there is room for export-import, and we have to reflect how we react on this fragmentation. And look, Texas is calling companies in Europe, saying we have the Inflation Reduction Act, we have lower energy price, and lower bureaucratic burden. And we have to react with really focused acceleration of elements of transition, with industrial energy price, and with proper regulation for getting things done. So my clear answer is not react on America first with Europe first, but with Europe fast. We have to be quicker. 1.5 year time for approval for green hydrogen project is too long. 1 year for waiting for approval for state aid for a transformation of steel products too long. So Europe fast is the answer in the globalized world.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Chief Economist Jaworczyk, if you want to add a few words on this topic. Can we raise the sound?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be joining you. 3 very quick points. We've heard about incentives that are on offer in other countries. If Europe is to respond to those incentives with loosening of its own state aid rules, then I think we need to be very clear in our minds why we are doing this. Is it about stimulating economies of scale, or is it because we are worried about relocation of industries that generate knowledge spillovers? And if so, then this relaxation of state aid rules should benefit these particular industries with scaled economies or industries generating knowledge spillovers. Second, I think we should be focusing, when we focus on those state aid rules, we should avoid undermining European unity. Various countries have different amount of fiscal space, and in an environment of high interest rates, fiscal space is not going to become greater. So we should make sure that it's not only Europe as a whole that's going to win from that, but also that majority of the member states will benefit. And third, I think we should be facilitating resilience of supply chains, not through regulation, but by supporting creation of new trading relationships. The process of relocation of global value chains has started. For instance, 2/3 of German firms have already added new suppliers. But new relationships between trading partners mean greater risk. And therefore, they can be facilitated by trade finance instruments that insure the risk of these international trade transactions. And here, I'm happy to say that my own institution, the EBRD, is quite active in the trade finance space and ready to help.
Thank you. Professor Yu, with you, I would like to tackle a different question, but please also come in on the previous one if you like. We are, therefore, in this geoeconomic fragmentation era, a lot of people are talking about, which is WTO reform. And I wanted to ask, is this, a dead end at this point? Can the WTO survive the shock of the titans between the US and China, in your view?
Let me take that question, and then I will, maybe I'll make just a follow-on comment from the previous question, which I think your question about geoeconomic fragmentation does play a role in. So in a sense, I think we are looking at a period in which great power competition will put politics amidst economics. So I think I agree with what Beata had just outlined, and I just wanted to add, if Europe is at a turning point and you are in an era where there is great competition, great power competition, then Europe needs to focus on making sure that its firms are investing and it's creating the ecosystem for its industries to be able to thrive. And part of that is supply chain resilience. But the other part of it is just investment in green technology, making sure, and I keep saying ecosystem because it's financing, it's regulation, it's skills, and policy plays a big part in it. And it has, I think, the potential in this tech race for Europe to excel, but it would need to, I think, accelerate its gain because the US and China are actually quite advanced in terms of being able to create very large tech conglomerates, and Europe currently isn't. So stepping back a bit, when you look at surveys of European firms, what is holding back investment, even though they all say they want to invest more in digital. So this is across the spectrum, not just big tech companies, but all companies have to increase their game. The two reasons are lack of skills, and that's where policy can play a role in making sure that the labor force is attractive, and that's part of the ecosystem. The other part is reducing uncertainty. Firms don't want to invest if energy is insecure. They also will hold back in this kind of uncertain period. So regulatory uncertainty, policy uncertainty, all those things do need to be looked at, and part of that is supply chain resilience. So having a resilient supply chain means being very clear which supply chains will be subject to more, say, stress testing or scrutiny. And it is up to firms to make those alternatives, energy firms and policy working together to make sure that it is having not everything in one country, but actually having plan B, plan C, plan D. So to me, that would help the ecosystem develop and hopefully be able to accelerate European, industry at a time when the race for tech is so important. So coming to your WTO point, I think the WTO has actually made recently, obviously there are a number of things we could touch on, but I'm just going to focus on where there has been progress, and Europe indeed plays a role in this as well. The WTO is headed down a plurilateral route. So this is not the easiest term to use. That we might need a rebranding of the term, but it just means that a group of like-minded countries come together and agree to set rules around services liberalization, which has just had a breakthrough. So that means that the US and China have actually joined the plurilateral effort and agreed to upgrade GATS, which is a set of rules that govern services trade. This is an absolutely critical area which encompasses digital trade. And so this breakthrough suggests to me that plurilaterally, even in this era of geoeconomic tensions, countries seem to understand the principle. You know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So it's much better to be at the table formulating global rules. And to me, that's where the World Trade Organization has made progress and continue to do so. But it requires leadership. And Europe, sitting between the great power competition in many ways, is well positioned, I think, to make that to take that lead, and that would actually benefit its industries as well. If you set the rules, you do have it can work for your own industries.
Thank you for that answer. VP, I'm coming back to you, and you mentioned two things that we're coming back to, the outbound FDI screening and the raw materials strategy. But since we're talking about the US and China and their increasing geopolitical strategic competition over all kinds of sectors, over trade, over AI, over clean tech, raw materials, and so on, Europe is seemingly caught in the middle and needs to decide what is its stance in this tension. In a recent speech, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen spoke of economic de-risking the China-EU relationship, arguing that perhaps more trade restriction and the outward FDI might be needed. And the European Union is revisiting its China strategy at a meeting of foreign ministers next week. So what I'm asking you is, in this power race, how should Europe position itself? Is the EU going to take a more aggressive stance vis-à-vis China, and is it ready for the costs that will come with that?
First of all, EU is a geopolitical player itself with our own interests and values. So this is what we want to project to the world. If you look at our bilateral relations with US, EU and US are strategic allies. We have largest, most important trade and developing new cooperation formats through the Trade Technology Council. Now we are working on our transatlantic initiative on sustainable trade, to give just some examples. At the same time, of course, we need to tackle also irritants in our relations, like Inflation Reduction Act and its discriminatory provisions, and we are on one hand in intensive engagement with US authorities, on another hand, of course, looking what is our own policy response, and we talked already about our Green Deal industrial plan, which is part of that policy response. Then, when it concerns China, indeed, we are not talking about decoupling from China, but rather de-risking, so better risk management. When I was talking, for example, on not allowing new strategic dependencies to develop on, for example, many rare earth metals, China has clearly a dominant position. So what we want to develop is not a strategic dependency, but we want to have a diversified and thus resilient supply chain. So that's what we want to achieve through our raw material strategy, but also more broadly also by pursuing trade agreements and other forms of partnership with reliable partners around the world. So as regards China, it's still very important trade relations. China is our second biggest trading partner. But on one hand, we know that it's asymmetric, so there are many issues on the market access which we still need to address vis-à-vis China. Recently, also the China's trade minister Wang was visiting Brussels, so we had in-depth conversations on those topics, and we need this diversification and thus resilience of supplies so that we don't have those dependencies.
Thank you. Chairman, as a multinational conglomerate operating all over the world, how do you see these risks for your supply chains, and how should it straddle these tensions?
Well, let me first say that I think this notion of decoupling from China is a really bad idea. I graduated in 1989, and later I realized how lucky I was to graduate that year, because that was the year the Berlin Wall fell, and with that, globalization propelled economic growth and opportunities for me and everyone in business, and I think societies at large. We were probably a little bit too naive, and if you look at the globalization that has been happening, particularly around China, it's been labor arbitrage driven. So where's the cheapest labor? I think we're coming to an end, luckily, we're coming to an end of that, become driven by the access to talent, to ideas, to innovations, to scale, to raw materials that are needed to create those sustainable solutions of the future. So that, in a time when we have the chance technologically and we have the need from a climate point of view, could actually dramatically accelerate those solutions because we collaborate globally. That is the kind of globalization that I'm arguing for. And in that context, I think Europe actually, while we are being threatened a little bit by the big game, by the big countries that mostly for domestic reasons are going into a fight, don't forget that, maybe Europe could play the role of the collaborator in this world. And instead of just betting on the two big countries, what if we could have 10 countries participate in that supply chain and not have one big factory in one country, but 9 factories in 9 other countries as well? That would increase global trade, to the point made earlier. It would make livelihood possible in more countries in the world. With that, we would reduce the risk of migration of people who want to go to a place where there are opportunities. There will be opportunities everywhere. And so there are many aspects of this that we need to take into account before we jump to the conclusion, let's decouple. I can understand the point of view from an American, let's say, political dimension, because it's the power of, power game. But I'm on a different game here. I'm on a let's create a better future game. And I think that requires a more radical and more collaborative leadership than what we see when we talk about power. For me, it's about impact. And I think Europe has the best cultural heritage to participate in that kind of dialogue, because we are a multicultural region. We're used to trading because each one of our countries were too small. We've created, an open market in Europe, could still be a little bit more open, which allows us to get competitive. And most companies in Europe are global companies. Siemens is a very large global company, but even Northvolt, a newly started green battery company, has an order book of 50 billion euros and just building its first factory of a green product, a green battery. So my point is that before we fall in the easy trap of accepting that there is a decoupling and it's time, I would argue let's look at it from a different angle. Let's look at it from an optimistic and innovation and scale angle, invite more countries in and use the cultural diversity that Europe has as its core to be the leader of this collaboration that is required to dramatically scale the solutions of the future.
Hellange, you come from a country and an institution that arguably has taken a slightly more hawkish view on China recently. What is your take on where should Europe go in the relationship between these two superpowers?
Yes, I think we have to reflect our strategy. And I would not say that we were naive. I would say there was a theory of free trade, a narrative cutting down tariffs and looking only to cost efficiency. This was the narrative. And I guess this is coming to an end. And now we have to reflect how we can set the conditions right. And for me, it's totally clear that we need 3 levels of action. One is the unilateral level to defend our economic interests, also towards China. It's not acceptable that China is using trade and investment to try to push for political change inside European Union, like the case of Lithuania. So we created, and I was luckily the rapporteur, the anti-coercion instrument. And that's an important unilateral measures to defend our values. And yes, I'm also in line with not saying we should decouple, we should de-risk, but we have to establish proper relations also with China, but in a condition framework where we can defend our interests. So we have some other elements for making the level playing field fair as well. So this is a unilateral level, and this is quite new. This is what's in the old narrative not possible. So there we open our doors and nothing else. Second level is the level of bilateral trade agreements. And there we have to look a little bit more carefully regarding the sustainability also for the people where we are having a trade agreement with, so that they have also better benefit from the trade and added value. Now we are concluding an agreement with Chile. Chile is a major supplier of lithium, which is necessary for the transition. And it is also, of course, important to guarantee that the labor conditions are fair, that the environment conditions are fair in mining lithium, and that Chile has also an added value in processing lithium. By the way, this is also in our interest of de-risking, because it's a crazy situation, ladies and gentlemen, that we have the mining of lithium in Peru, Chile, and Argentina, and around about 60% of the processing of lithium is done in China. And 80% of our demand of lithium is delivered by China. So it is also in our interest that in Chile a processing possibility is there so that we can diversify our dependency. So bilateral, sustainable partnership, that's the second level. And the third level, don't forget the WTO. Even it's complicated and our American friends have not the engagement at the moment which is necessary, but nevertheless we should also try to integrate some further elements in the rule book regarding sustainability into the WTO. First step was this fishery agreement. Let's see what's possible also regarding the digital area, so that we have also an attempt to set conditions right on the multilateral level. So 3 levels to tackle also the problems raised by China.
Thank you. Chief Economist, you work in a multilateral development bank which often deals with the question of competition between different countries for influence. What is your view of what an institution like yours should do when it comes to investing in different countries and kind of bringing Europe where it's not?
Well, I may sound idealistic, but coming from a multilateral development bank, I believe that Europe should position itself as a defender of multilateralism. Creation of the WTO, of the stable global trading rules, of the dispute settlement mechanism, these were all great achievements. Unfortunately, the WTO has been weakened, the global China trade war, and the dispute settlement mechanism stopped working. I worry that we are heading towards decoupling, and that is because while previously globalization has been fueled by economic interest, the current retreat from globalization is driven by political considerations, even if often with the full understanding of the economic weaknesses, could be more vocal in defending globalization. Being based in London, I look back at the Brexit debate when the UK businesses did not participate very much for the fear of offending parts of the population who were supporting the Leave campaign. I think we are now in a similar situation with respect to decoupling. I think there's an ending multilateralism. You know, there is a narrative out there, countries thinking about how they could benefit from this decoupling, and this is true of some emerging economies. And they think that it is an opportunity for them. I think it is a false narrative, and that's because once we leave the world of global trading rules, all bets are off. There will be nothing that will constrain arbitrary increases of tariffs. There will be nothing that will constrain export restrictions, and there will be nothing that will limit subsidies. So I think international trade without multilateralism can descend into chaos. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, we turn to you, and same question for you. What is there to worry about in decoupling, and what are you seeing?
I think there's quite a lot to worry about when we're talking about decoupling. I think just stepping back and thinking about how Europe and indeed lots of countries might want to operate in this era of geoeconomic tensions, great power competition. I think the very first thing is using values to determine the areas in which there will be, say, competition with China, or even indeed competition with the United States, and the areas in which there will be cooperation. So, for instance, if we want to make progress and indeed attempt to meet our net zero goals, then cooperating with China on global public goods like the environment is essential. And then the areas in which, given the tensions, can we specify in a transparent way the commercial relationships, whether that's trade or investment, the ones in which there ought to be, for instance, transparent rules around which supply chains have, say, national security implications, which technology areas have dual use implications, and just be very clear that those are areas in which our policies, values-driven aims will affect the rules around trade and investment with China, with countries that don't share those values, how those areas might be governed looking forward. Because I think at the moment, it's not clear where countries will cooperate. It's not clear where they want to compete, and it's certainly not clear which commercial relationships are affected by geoeconomics and which ones firms could think less about. So, it's not an easy exercise, politicizing trade. Sometimes it's called the weaponization of trade. I don't think this is the equilibrium that we want to be at. So, yes, there'll be areas in which I think that's going to be very much one in which different countries and groups are going to want to set standards, ideally at the multilateral level. As I mentioned, the WTO is moving forward on a plurilateral way to achieve that, so that there can be a rules-based system governing some of the most important, at the moment, not specified standards in the tech arena. But I just think this idea generally of making clear how Europe will operate, in the areas of competition, cooperation, and advancing rules. I think that will be a way of finding a better equilibrium unfortunately, in an environment in which that will spill over into economic relationships.
Thank you. In the rest of the time that we are left, I would like to unpack some of this macro debate and bring it to policies. And two specific key areas were mentioned, and one is outbound FDI. And I would like to ask you, Commissioner, Vice President, what exactly is the drive to go there? it's a very unconventional thing for Europe, which has always been about open investment, open trade, to think that we should screen not just inbound to level the playing field, but also outbound for an investment. And to Chairman, I would like to ask, is this somehow infringing on economic freedom?
At preliminary stage, so in a sense this exact concept is still to be shaped, but the basic idea is to prevent, for example, military dual-use technologies ending up in wrong hands or ending up in what we call destinations of concern. And I would say in particular in a current geopolitical situation when we are faced with Russia's aggression against Ukraine, I think this narrative becomes very clear. What are the security risks if advanced technologies, military technologies, dual-use technologies ends up in the wrong hands?
Yeah, you are right that this is limitations, and obviously businesses hate limitations. Now, I do believe we need limitations. We need, let's say, rules of the game that are defined based on societal goals, and so in that sense I'm not against rules of the game. But I do believe that we need to be careful to be limiting, for instance, investments. I think we need more investments, not less investments. And I think we need to challenge ourselves that it's not just where the money goes, but also the kind of innovations and changes to our assumptions that we can make. A good example, which was discussed indirectly here a few times, is the need for lithium. If we don't get enough lithium, we can't build the battery technologies that are necessary to do the electric vehicles, the energy system transition, etc. So we need that. Now, the design we chose at Northvolt was a circular value chain, which means that the batteries that are then being used, and once they have been finalized in their use, can be repurposed in the sense that we actually take the...
Hi everyone, let's address the elephant in the room. The climate crisis and the ecological crisis are about to bring us to a war for resources, for water and food, and this is Frans Timmermans I'm quoting. This is the level of danger we're in. And we can talk about green technologies and whatever, you can fill the ocean and the earth with windmills and with batteries, but it won't save us because we're nowhere. Also the EU, nowhere on our direction to sustainable development goals, to our Paris Accord goals, and the time is running, it's really too late. We urgently need to consume and produce less, and that's okay. Ban advertising, ban cars or impose car sharing, invest everything you can in public transport and try to make sure people are fine. Invest in insulation of people's homes to make sure we consume less. But about energy, do you know in Belgium, if we would completely finish our transition to green energy, actually the benefit, the money the sector would make would go down by 20%. And that's the thing. We need growth is the problem. Growth is an ideology which we need to get rid of. And we need to plan another economy. I know it's not easy, for sure, but with strong tariffs, and some of the speakers talked about it, and sovereignty, and that we have enough water that we can take ourselves, and the EU can take of itself and transition to another type of economy. We need to plan it a bit more. We can't make it.
Well, that's also a point of view. I think we can resume, maybe.
Could I maybe use the opportunity? I think thank you for raising the attention. I think this is very, very important. There is no doubt that we are way too slow with our current. This is not funny. This is very serious, okay? Now, my point that I was making before is that if we create all raw materials in a battery, we recycle it to the next battery, and to the next battery, and to the next battery. And this is how we solve this problem, that we can have growth. That is where we're going to. That is why we have, huge investments to set up European factories to build batteries that way. We need to reinvent the food system.
I'm sorry, but there is in 10 minutes we're going towards questions, and then we can really have a debate rather than talking over each other. Thank you. Okay.
And Europe can show the way. So I agree with the urgency, but we don't want craziness. We want action. I'm tired of craziness.
And moving on, we have addressed it in various answers, but I think that from all that's emerged, one area which is really critical is raw materials. And undoubtedly China has control of the huge supply of these. 98% of rare earths, 93% of magnesium, 97% of lithium. And the EU has laid out plans to actually diversify the supply chains. We've just talked about the trade agreement with Chile, but it will have to keep relying on imports for most of its consumption, including in battery production. So I would like to ask, in light of the US vis-a-vis China on semiconductors, and China considering a ban on rare earth magnets, what are Europe's options really, and to what extent are you worried about the Chinese threat of imposing more exports controls on raw materials? Vice President.
Indeed, we were talking already about this before. That is about our raw material strategy. Because indeed we cannot be reliant on a single provider, especially in current increasingly fragmented geopolitical context. So we need to develop resilience and diversification of supply chains, and that's what we are aiming both through our network of free trade agreements, targeted raw material partnerships with countries, raw materials club, which we want to create to bring together resource-rich countries with consuming countries and finding a mutually beneficial way of cooperation, letting also resource-rich countries to develop their value chains. Of course, we're also looking at domestic, both mining and extraction, and also recycling. Other speakers had been already addressing this aspect. But even in our raw material strategy, we set, which are ambitious goals, that by 2030 we should have 10% of our production for mining and extraction. It means that 90% we need to get still outside the EU, and 40% target for recycling, because in recycling, indeed, we may be leaders in this area, and we need to use this potential.
Thank you. I'm going to switch the order up. Professor Yu, on the same question, you've talked about which sector is going to be impacted the most by these new earths, lithium, are going to be some of the areas where the competition will be the toughest, and how to address that?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I think this is an area where what I described as the intersection between politics and economics becomes very clear. And this is why I think it's even more important to have areas in which you do, China is not, there's lots of things we could say about China's own economic development needs, but China is a major economy. It has, I mentioned earlier, signed up to the plurilateral, agreement on services trade liberalization. So I think looking at China's own development needs, it's not in its interest to decouple in the way that we're describing. There's areas of fierce competition. They themselves are very focused on the need to import the semiconductor chips. The restrictions there are affecting their ability to upgrade from a middle-income country into one that is higher income and has higher tech in its own industries and services. So when you do have, mutual needs, then that opens a space for setting out an understanding of what some of those rules around trade and investment might be. And so I would think that we are in an era where it's even more important to come to the table and recognize each other's needs, weaknesses, strengths, and politics is the art of the possible. There's in no country's interest to be in a trade war with restrictions, and I think it is about setting out a clear framework for how trade in rare earths or semiconductor chips or investment rules are going to be conducted in certain sectors, and that would actually benefit China, it would benefit Europe, it would benefit the US, and really everyone else. So I don't think we could not see that indeed, this weaponization of trade that I've described is happening. And I should just add, it's not just between the US and China or, China, other countries. Other countries are also using trade restrictions as a way of expressing political dissatisfaction in their foreign policies. And this as a trend is highly worrying. To find areas of cooperation and areas of competition, hopefully can help us pull back from this undesirable, state.
Thank you. Herr Lange, same question to you. Is the EU doing enough to secure its place in the race for clean tech and especially for raw materials?
Yeah, of course, the recycling question is the most important question. I guess at the moment we have recycling quotes for the batteries in your smartphones from under 10%. And this is incredible. We have a increasing demand on specific raw materials like lithium and other than cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo and so on. So we need really have a circular economy and also the right for repair. We have preparing now some legislation on this so that we really have a closed use of raw materials. And secondly, yes, we want to have a real sustainable partnership with third countries. The dependency on China is there, but only on a limited and of our trade relations are quite fine and unproblematic. But there are some. I mentioned the example with lithium, and we have some others as well. This is now the chance to have a different way of partnership with the developing world, a sustainable partnership. If we are investing in renewable energies in South Africa to produce green hydrogen, which is necessary for our transition, then it is also the possibility for South Africa to change their electricity production from coal to renewable energy, and also looking for some raw materials which they are mining and give also the possibility to possess them and have added value. We have really to look for a different kind of partnership to the developing world based on really interest on both sides. Otherwise, we will lose Africa to China. And perhaps this is materials coming from China at the moment.
Thank you. And Chief Economist, I'm going to close the round with you, and then we're going to turn to Q&A. We talked about losing Africa and, trying to ensure that our trade relationships are mutually beneficial. Are we able to do that as it is, and what should we do differently?
We've heard diversification and recycling mentioned. Both are great, but there is a limit to how much both can achieve. The problem with friendshoring is that friendships can be fleeting. And, as the famous quote goes, there are no eternal allies and no perpetual enemies. So, at the end of the day, multilateral cooperation is the optimal solution. Not an easy solution, but that's something we should strive towards.
Thank you.
We try day by day.
I'm going to pick a few questions for Slido, and they'll be roaming around. I find this anonymous one, but quite interesting. Should we differentiate more clearly between geopolitical allies, for instance, the US, Australia, and Japan, and foes, their words, China, so more friendshoring than diversification? Maybe, Professor Yu, we can start with you. Should we be classifying our trading partners according to friend or foe?
Oh, I think Beata gave a really good answer to that, which is, there's even a term frenemies. Sometimes you're friends, but you're really not quite friends. Much more seriously, I think there are areas in which a values-based foreign policy would value and trust allies on the security front with areas, of technology or supply chains. And I think that is already happening. And I think acknowledging the areas in which, the economic or the commercial prerogative is going to be affected. I think just making that clear would be a way of setting out if there are industries and sectors that will be treated, differently. But on the whole, I think the idea that you diversify and make resilient supply chains is about having options. So just to repeat briefly what I said before, I think the most important thing and the creating uncertainty at the moment is that it's very hard for firms or investors to work out where policy is going to affect what was previously a commercial decision. So if there are areas which are going to be carved out, and I think governments need to think very carefully about whether those really are the areas, the sectors, the industries that you are going to carve out, then that just forms a clear foundation for negotiating, with allies in those countries which are not currently allies and countries that you're competing against, where you stand. And for instance, if you look at China's Made in 2025 plan, they're very clear. They set out the sectors in which they will prioritize, will not treat those areas on commercial terms. So I think just being clear on that and not making that list so expansive that it doesn't, start to distort rather than to serve that purpose. I think that would probably be a better way to approach it than to start to categorize, countries which sometimes are aligned with you on certain things and may not be aligned with you on other things, or may not be aligned tomorrow.
Thank you. Anybody wants to add something on this question? I saw you nodding, Herr Lange.
Yeah, it's totally clear. So nobody knows exactly what is a friend. So I guess, and I use always the terminology reliable partner. And we can't really use our pointing finger and saying you are a friend, your system is okay, you are not. It has to be the reliable partner, and that we have to look for.
Thank you. Vice President.
I fully agree with you emphasizing this development of network with reliable partners around the world. We are certainly seeing also already some economic trends along those geopolitical lines of divide. And while trade in goods indeed continues to grow, as some colleagues already been saying, we see that the tendencies in foreign direct investment is indeed more, so to say, within those geopolitical blocks than between the geopolitical blocks. So certain tendencies in investment we are already seeing. But also it's clear that we need to distinguish different situations. It's clear that by and large we are decoupling from Russia, because clearly Russia with its aggression against Ukraine, with the war crimes it's committing, with violating every possible international law, itself a pariah, and clearly this is not a country we can deal with. We need to the contrary, to put it in isolation and do everything necessary to support Ukraine so it can win the war. On other countries, as you know, in China, our position is much more nuanced. We see it as a cooperation partner on some areas, like to deal with climate change, with global environmental challenges. We need China on board as the biggest emitter. On other areas, it's economic competitor. We can discuss very long level playing field issues, and in others, it's systemic rival, because indeed China is promoting different socio-economic model. So in relations with China, we need to navigate this complexity and certainly work on this concept of de-risking and better risk management, not allowing...
A question for you, Hesnabe. Are firms doing enough to de-risk through more strategic supplier relationships and stockpiling, or do we need state intervention and incentives also here in Europe?
No, I think companies have learned a lot from the last few years. First of all, COVID did disrupt quite dramatically supply chains and reminded everyone about single sourcing as a challenge and a risk. I think the war in Ukraine has not made things easier, and another reminder. I do agree with the comments made. Siemens operates in more than 180 countries. I'd like to believe that we not only operate in 180 countries, but that we improve societies in which we operate. We have 310,000 employees around the world. And when we go in a country and operate there, we operate according to our global values. So we are not a political force, but we are a force for good, a force for progress, a force for economic opportunity, a force for employment and skill development. And therefore, I do believe that we need to be careful so that we get more friends and we influence those friends. And I think that's the foundation that was created after the Second World War, was about how do we create dependencies and interaction and collaboration. We need it more than ever now. So what companies are doing, they are reducing their dependencies, they are increasing their resilience. We are looking for multiple sources, and I think this is the path forward, so that you still have, let's say, efficient supply chains, not as efficient as before. They became almost too efficient. It was like just-in-time supply chains. What we are doing now is creating just-in-case supply chains, but with levels of efficiency and hopefully enough collaboration so that we can deploy the sustainable solutions for the future at much greater pace than what we've seen in the past and until now.
Thank you. Would there be questions from the audience? Don't be shy, there is one there. If we can get a mic. Keep your hand raised. Thank you. Please state your name and your organization.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Rajai Barakat. Mr. Vice President, you spoke about resilience. Who is going to raise the consequences of this resilience? As you notice, people in Europe now are suffering from what's happening. The bad situation, economic situation before COVID-19, the war in Ukraine. In your statistic, you speak about inflation, 9, 10, 11%, but when we go to supermarkets, it's 20, 30, some products are more than 50% more than usual. If you continue your policy against China, and if you are going to follow USA and consider China as an enemy or dangerous for our economy, what's going to happen? Are you able to face all these problems? And also, knowing now that what's happening with Russia make our products, our energy more expensive. And if you make more relations with USA, what's going to happen if in USA you are going to have a new president who may be you than President Trump? Thank you very much.
Very interesting question.
Yeah, well, first of all, on our economic response to pandemic, also to disruptions posed by Russia's aggression against Ukraine. I could talk for a long time on this. I'll be relatively short. So first, on COVID-19 pandemic, we came with a strong and coordinated European response, also with strong European level support packages like SURE, for example, to provide support for member states for part-time jobs, so to put simply to keep people in jobs during the times of lockdowns. In a sense, more companies, more jobs we could preserve during the lockdown, the faster economy was able to recover, and we actually were very quick to go back to pre-COVID economic levels. With Russia's aggression against Ukraine came new disruptions, you rightly noted, high energy prices, high food prices, which are the main drivers of inflation. So we had to deal with both. First, Russia clearly was willing to use its fossil fuel, especially gas supplies, as a weapon of blackmail and manipulation. Russian officials were talking about this. There were even advertisements made by Gazprom how Europe will be freezing this winter. Well, we managed to very quickly diversify our member states were providing large support packages to limit the impact of high energy prices on people's heating bills and utilities bills. So on food prices, we also came with a food security package, both on the supply and demand side, to address challenges we are facing. Clearly, now we are on the path of the recovery, and the situation is somewhat better than we were expecting maybe half a year ago. So we are avoiding a recession, but still we are not out of the woods. So still we need to be agile, to be able to react to the situation as it develops, and to deploy right policy tools, because also, as IMF was recently putting it, we are looking for a rocky recovery.
Thank you. We only have 1 minute left. Is anybody willing to jump on that question? Or can we take one last very quick question from the room? Unfortunately, Slido has died.
Hello? Hi? Hello?
No? Well,
no,
then...
they can't hear me. Can you hear me? Oh. Hi, sorry, I have one quick question.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm a journalist. My name's Suniva Rose. I work for The National. My question is for Mr. Dombrovskis. I'd like to address the action that just happened in the room, if possible, to get maybe a response from Mr. Dombrovskis. What is your answer to these protesters, mostly from the younger generation, who believe that policymakers like yourself are disconnected from the urgency of climate actions, especially that in Europe we're seeing more and more of these kinds of spectacular actions, or more violent in some countries like we saw today? Or do these kinds of actions maybe not have an impact on policymakers like yourself? Thank you.
Without going into particularities, I think what we saw is related in a sense with the demands of EU moving faster on delivering the European Green Deal, achieving climate neutrality, addressing other environmental challenges. And that's exactly what we are doing. EU Green Deal is our flagship policy, acceptable to the broader society, because a Green Deal is only going to happen if it's going to be socially acceptable. So it's important that we bring not only activists with us, but we bring a broader society with us. Thank you.
Could I maybe add one comment to that? Because I think it's important. So what happened here is a reminder of urgency. I think the approach is wrong, because it doesn't help to just protest. And I'm arguing to everyone in this room and everyone out there that this is a time for radical leadership, where we have the courage to dream about a different future and act, not protest. Act faster in collaboration, so we get there much, much faster.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's all we have time for today. I'm sorry for that. But
let me make one remark. So we are doing a lot in the European Parliament, even to strengthen the proposal by the Commission in a democratic way. And I recognize the concerns of the young people. Please be engaged in the democratic process. On the 9th of June next year, we have a European election. Be engaged in the democratic process and change if you are not agreeing with the things happening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank Professor Yu and Beata Jaworczyk for joining us online. That's it for this panel. Thanks for the panelists for an engaging conversation and the contribution from the audience. I leave you to the next panel.
Thank you so much for this. And now it is time for last but definitely not least speaker of the day that we are about to have here at the Brussels Economic Forum. But before, once again, let's say thank you so much. Thank you for the session. We're very honoured to have with us today the Irish Minister for Public Expenditure, National Development Plan Delivery and Reform and President of the Eurogroup, Pascal Donoghue, for the closing keynote at the Brussels Economic Forum 2023.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm very conscious that you spent the day discussing some very important topics regarding the future of Europe, the future of our environment, and the future of our economies. I know you've covered an awful lot of ground, and I want to thank the Commission, I want to thank Paolo, and I want to thank, of course, Valdis and all of their team at DG ECFIN for the opportunity to be here and for this very, very important forum. What I'm not going to do at this point is try to summarise all of the different themes that you've discussed and all the ground that you have covered. But what I want to do, and I'm going to do so briefly, is just offer a perspective from that of the Eurogroup on some of the different themes that you've discussed during the day and the different actions that are being taken by ministers, by members of the Eurogroup and by myself to respond back to the challenges and opportunities that you have discussed. And in thinking how to do so, and in looking to frame my thoughts, and conscious that I'm at the Brussels Economic Forum, what I'm going to do is just cover off three themes of BEF, because I think these themes do represent and succinctly summarise the different areas that have been your focus during today. So what I'll do is begin with B, and in this case the B that I'm referring to is the B of banking union. And deepening banking union and trying to make progress on banking union has been a big area of focus of mine during my time as President of the Eurogroup, and has absorbed a huge amount of ministerial effort and focus because it's such an important way of strengthening the architecture of the euro and the European Union, and also because we're all aware of the sensitivity and challenges involved in making progress on it. And last summer, after a huge amount of effort and engagement, ministers did reach agreement on a statement, and a clear statement, regarding how we would advance and how we would deepen banking union. And very specifically, we asked for further steps to be taken to strengthen the common framework for bank crisis management, and also with regard to national deposit insurance schemes, or CMDI in short. And 2 weeks ago, after a huge amount of work, the Commission did come forward with legislative proposals in this area, which encompassed all of the areas that the Eurogroup discussed for over a year and concluded on last June. Last Friday then, at our Eurogroup informal meeting in Stockholm, we had a very frank and I believe overall a very good discussion on the banking sector, on the recent developments that you're all aware of, and on the broad outlines of the CMDI proposal itself. As things stand at the moment, there are areas in which ministers are agreed, but as you'd also expect, areas in which we're not currently aligned, where we have more work to do. However, I am confident that in the time ahead, we will find ways to converge and we will find ways to reach agreement. And one of the reasons as to why we will do this is that events over the last few months, weeks and even days in both the US and Europe have reaffirmed to all of us, if we did need reaffirmation, that there is a real need for us to continue with our progress in banking union and making it a source of resilience. So moving on from B to E, I'll move on to the economic governance review and the huge work underway with regard to that. And similar to the work that's undertaken on banking union, Last week, as you all know, the Commission tabled legislative proposals on planned reforms to Europe's fiscal framework. And this has been a subject that has featured very prominently in Eurogroup discussions over the last 2.5 years, starting from the activation of the General Escape Clause in very difficult circumstances in March 2020. While the focus now on the legislation with regard to this at EU 27 level does have to sit within ECOFIN, the Eurogroup has discussed the framework and specifically the euro area aspects of this framework on a number of occasions. And we've also regularly set out budgetary guidance for the euro through regular statements by the Eurogroup. On the legislative proposals that have been brought forward, I think the Commission, the Swedish Presidency, ministers and officials deserve a lot of credit for getting us so far to this point. Similarly, with regard to banking union, the easiest thing to do would have been to wait. But the Commission has moved forward and it has exercised its right of initiative in putting forward very detailed proposals. This is a very complex project, but agreeing on a framework is absolutely vital. And again, with regard to, and similar to my comment there a moment ago on banking union, of course there are different views. Of course there are different traditions and political outlooks that will respond back to these proposals. But agreement overall will be vital. Because what we do need is a framework that's simpler, more risk-based, and one that has a focus on where we will be in the medium term. Because this, in turn, will make the implementation and the enforcement of these rules more transparent and clearer. The proposals acknowledge this. They acknowledge the need for investment, for growth and for debt sustainability. And it's now so important that we all focus our efforts on how we reach agreement. Because it has to be emphasised that there is a vital euro area dimension to a successful conclusion, which is that a credible budgetary framework for the medium term is an essential pillar in the architecture of the euro. So with B and E covered, I'm now going to move to my final point, which is F, which is about the future. And this will be my concluding comments on where we stand now. In listening to some of the other discussions that have happened across the day, it has reaffirmed to me two key economic priorities for the euro area. And these are the digital euro and access to capital. And in both of those areas, the Eurogroup has had a lot to do. If I begin with the digital euro, this is something that we have now actively engaged in for well over a year. We've had very constructive engagement with both the ECB and the Commission, and we welcome the latter's intention to propose legislation on the digital euro and also to recognise that we will need to continue our political engagement on this project in the time ahead. Finance ministers, us politicians, are very attuned to the fact that so many of the decisions on the digital euro are inherently and deeply political. They will really influence the daily lives of our citizens, and this is something that's reminded to me again and again in our decisions and discussions on how this currency will be designed. A second priority area will then be capital, how we organise our own savings. And during my time as president of the Eurogroup, I have now chaired 36 meetings of this group. And in every single meeting, investment needs and how we invest in the future has been raised. We're all acutely aware of the extensive financing needs that Europe has, that has been amplified by lack of investment in the previous decade, but also now the new investment needs that we have with regard to digitalisation and our climate. We know the investment needs will be very large over the next decade. We know both the private and public sector will need to play their role. And this is one of the reasons why, at the Euro Summit in March, European leaders called on their ministers to step up efforts with regard to how we can make more progress on this project. It is simply a vast project, but just to emphasise again that EMU, our monetary union, is dependent on a vibrant and well-integrated capital market to manage our shocks, but also to invest in our future. And from my perspective, I think it's now a good time to take stock of where we are in terms of funding, innovation and competitiveness, to support the work of the Swedish, Spanish, Belgian presidencies in working with the Parliament to make progress on current legislative priorities, but then to look beyond that, to look at how we can make progress in the medium term and do more. So I'll end on that point by giving an overview of the different areas of work of the Eurogroup in the years gone by and the important work we need to complete in the time ahead. I'm very conscious of the fact that we now have legislative proposals in two of these really important work streams that we need to make progress on. It's no small task, it's never easy, but the really important projects rarely are. And we'll have to make this progress because you're all so aware of how fast the world is changing around Europe. It's full of disruption, but it's also full of challenges. It's full of opportunities. The euro has demonstrated its resilience in confronting recent challenges in a pandemic and in a war, and I'm certain that it will continue to do so, and I'm certain that we can continue to demonstrate that economic interdependence is a source of strength for all of Europe. Thank you.
Pascal Donahue, the President of the Eurogroup, thank you so much for this closing keynote. Thank you very much. And with this speech, we are wrapping up the Brussels Economic Forum this year. We do have a few things to ask you. Please do go to Slido and share your thoughts and comments on what can we do better, on how can we cover more, what is it that you want to hear more, and we can address that for the next edition. And the second thing, let's just give a big round of applause for the teams working and organizing the Brussels Economic Forum every year. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody online and everybody here in the room. There is a reception happening now. We can see you there as well. If you're online, thank you so much. And that's a wrap. We see you next year. Thank you. Thank you very much.